Time and again, throughout the eons, the power of the dark side of the Force has advanced with the fury of a storm, sweeping up star system after star system. Only in great conflagration were the forces of the dark side defeated. The dark side has come before and it will come again. Do not underestimate its power. That is why I have devoted my life to teaching Jedi Knights, to strengthen the light side against the tide of darkness that is sure to come. You still have much to teach me. I will continue to study at your feet, Master. I will learn from your wisdom. I will discover your secrets, unlocking them one by one until everything you know, all your knowledge, and all your power is mine. And once you are no longer of use to me, I will destroy you. One day I will surpass you, and on that day I will kill you. My analyses of Jedi Weapon Master Vodo-Siosk Baas will be primarily drawn from his appearances in the Tales of the Jedi comic series and audio drama, with background information on his training and skill set pulled from the Power of the Jedi Sourcebook and the Jedi Academy Training Manual. My analyses of the Sith Sorceress Darth Zannah will be drawn from her main appearance in the Darth Bane Trilogy of novels, in addition to the Jedi vs. Sith comic series, with background information on her training and weaponry drawn from the Book of Sith and the article The Story of General Grievous, Lord of War. Background information on Jedi and Sith lore will be drawn from the Jedi Path, The Essential Guide to the Force, and the Old Republic Encyclopedia, among others. I essentially inherited this project from Evan Nova 95 and have been working on it for a while, but it struck me as a particularly appropriate companion to my collaboration with Grey Jedi 91, Exar Kun vs. Darth Bane. Given that both sets of characters are featured in the same set of sources, Tales of the Jedi and the Darth Bane Trilogy respectively, researching both sets of characters was relatively easy. Vodo-Siosk Baas, former master to the Firebrand who instigated the Great Sith War, and Darth Zannah, first apprentice to the Reformer who founded the Rule of Two. If these two controversial figures were to meet in single combat, who would win? While the Kravaki master Vodo-Siosk Baas is known to have served for centuries as a Jedi, little is known of his personal background. Based on the practices of the Jedi Order during his era, Baas was likely an adult recruit who participated in group training under a single master, just as he himself trained Credo, Silvar, and Exar Kun on Dantooine. A noted Jedi historian, he regarded the rise of powerful Darksiders as an inevitability, preaching constant vigilance while dedicating himself to training Jedi Knights to prepare the Order for this eventual conflagration. The sad irony is that it was his most formidable apprentice who spearheaded the rise of the dark side in Baas's lifetime. Vodo Baas trained as a Jedi Guardian, the martial crusaders of the Order, coming into his own as a Jedi weapon master specialized in quarterstaff. Though known to hold classroom workshops on lightsaber construction in the Ossus Library, his most prominent ability was Force Weapon, which allowed him to wield a simple wooden shaft to great effect in a lightsaber duel. When empowered in this manner, Baas's quarterstaff has been observed parrying lightsaber blades and delivering strikes capable of shattering stone, which I believe was achieved by using the shaft as a physical medium for tactile telekinesis, essentially delivering force pushes through physical contact. However, while this power allowed Baas to use potentially any loose object as an improvised weapon in a lightsaber duel, the empowerment could not be maintained indefinitely, leading to weapon failure in both of his major confrontations with Exar Kun. As a lifelong martial artist, Vodo-Siosk Baas obviously relied quite heavily on force-based physical enhancement to enable his fighting style, specifically emphasizing augmented speed and acrobatics. Unfortunately, Baas has not been credited with any significant skill in either the healing arts or energy manipulation, meaning he has no force-based means of mitigating injury or defending against force lightning. Given his policy of vigilance, Baas was clearly optimizing his skill set to combat Sith, but specifically the Sith of his era, who typically operated as magicians and spellcasters, as opposed to raw darkside channelers in the mold of Darths Bane or Sidious. Instead, Vodo Baas evidently focused on neutralizing mental interference and dispelling the effects of Sith magic, using battle mind to maintain his own composure, while reinforcing his allies with battle meditation, though his skill with the latter was obviously outclassed by that of his contemporaries, Arca-Jeth and Odan-Ur, and his inability to fully nullify the influence of Freedon Nad led to him being jolted out of meditation by the spirit's directed hatred. Instead, Vodo-Siosk mastered Farsight, notably helping to hone the natural talent of Crinda Dre, who became a renowned Jedi seer. Given that Dre directly founded the Jedi Covenant, a rogue chapter of the Order dedicated to preemptively stopping the return of the Sith by probing the future, she was clearly influenced by Baas's constant vigilance. However, the unhealthy extreme to which the Covenant took Baas's teachings led to tragedy, when the First Watch Circle murdered their own Padawans after becoming convinced that one of them was destined to become a Sith Lord. Vodo-Siosk Baas demonstrated his ability as a combative force wielder when he led the Jedi strike team that apprehended Sith Lord Ulic Qel-Droma during the Sith Mandalorian attack on Coruscant. He overwhelmed Qel-Droma's force defenses and disarmed both him and his bodyguard with telekinesis, before combining powers with Nomi Sunrider, Kay Qel-Droma, Dace Diath, and Silvar to subdue Ulic with a short-term application of Sever Force. I would describe this engagement as being a perfect example of Vodo-Siosk Baas in his element, coordinating the efforts of multiple Jedi to non-lethally disable a dark-side adversary, neutralizing enemies rather than killing them. However, the fact that Baas did not attempt to use Sever Force against Exar Kun suggests the possibility that he isn't capable of imprisoning such powerful Darksiders unassisted. In his applications, Vodo Baas treated the Force as a trump card, bringing down the hammer with alternative powers that most weren't prepared to defend against. Instead of supporting physical combat with telekinetic integration, he used physical combat to deliver tactile strikes with Force weapon. Instead of striking down opponents with active Force attacks, he stripped them of their powers, decisively ending the conflict without any loss of life. A true Jedi Master, Vodo-Siosk Baas ascended to the netherworld of the Force as a Force spirit, his physical form vanishing upon his death at Exar Kun's hand. The girl Zannah was brought to Ruusan as part of Jedi Scout Tor Snappet's pool of recruits because her cousin Darovit cheated on her behalf, passing off one of his minor Force feats as hers. When Snappet's ship was attacked en route by the Sith, Zannah fell overboard, but was saved by the native Rusanian bouncers. Her own powers awakened in response to Darth Bane's Firestorm ritual, allowing Zannah to instinctively shield herself and her bouncer companion La from the destruction. However, the majority of the bouncers were not so lucky, and the few survivors were driven insane by the experience, forcing the Jedi Army of Light to euthanize them to stem the tide of telepathically projected despair and agony. When Jedi soldiers inadvertently killed La, Zannah went mad with despair, unleashing her power and breaking their bodies. It was there that Darth Bane found her. As Bane's Sith apprentice, Zannah was put through various rigorous tests intended to gauge her ability with specific aspects of the Force, discovering that she possessed an aptitude for Sith magic and sorcery. Though Bane provided the knowledge, transcribing spells from Freeden Nad's holocron for her to practice, he was forced to step back while she taught herself, due to his lack of aptitude for Sith spellcasting. However, as Darth Bane's direct agent, Zannah was forced to emphasize stealth and concealment, becoming an adept spy and infiltrator, supplementing subtle Force manipulations with mundane deception and disguise. One of Bane's lessons involved tasking Zannah to lure a native Neek into their camp as an exercise in patience and subtlety, which she achieved after several days by bringing one food and allowing it to grow comfortable in her presence. From this exercise, Zannah learned that a gentle touch often had a more lasting effect than simple brute force, getting into the habit of supporting her mind tricks with verbal manipulation as opposed to simply dominating the minds of subjects. With Sith sorcery, she typically projected an aura of insignificance to deflect attention and move about unnoticed, used an active concealment spell to hide her Force signature, and learned to project a false light side aura when infiltrating the Jedi Temple. When she and Bane were nearly apprehended by the Jedi on Umbria, Zannah placed a concealment spell on the location to hide their Force signatures, the spell effect being powerful enough that the Force senses of the eventual Darth Cognus were momentarily overwhelmed by the spell's Force echo 10 years later. Darth Zannah's primary offensive abilities were her Sith spells of Fear and Madness, essentially a heightened version of the memory walk technique discussed by Bane in his manifesto. The spells functioned by dredging up subconscious nightmares and giving them life as Force illusions. Though these spells initially required complex hand gestures to be used, by the time Zannah seized the mantle, she simply had to concentrate to access her powers. At their most powerful, these spells could shatter the minds of victims, reducing them to catatonic husks, though Zannah possessed a fine degree of control over the energy level, casting a weaker spell on Setharth to test his mental fortitude. However, Darth Bane successfully marshaled his willpower and resisted the spell, dispelling the illusions with a burst of dark side energy. I personally consider Zannah's effectiveness against Jedi duelist Saro Zaj to be the best baseline demonstration of her power, successfully fooling her target with the illusions, leaving them open to a backstab, but not destroying their minds. As Bane judged Zannah to be physically unfit for the more aggressive lightsaber forms, she obviously was not encouraged to give herself over to dark rage, with her application of physical enhancement instead emphasizing agility and reflex, to enable a fighting style based on evasion and redirection. However, she never displayed any ability with the healing arts, likely a result of Bane's lack of familiarity with such techniques, as well as a perceived weakness of Darksiders. Furthermore, and even more egregiously, Zannah has never displayed any powers of energy manipulation, offensive or defensive, instead relying on her lightsaber to defend against Force lightning. This is especially odd, given Bane's fondness and aptitude for lightning and his familiarity with its brothers, convection and cryokinesis. Prior to her training, Zannah demonstrated a primal aptitude for telekinesis, performing feats of levitation and channeling her emotions to instinctively rend the bodies of her victims, most notably disintegrating her cousin Darovit's right arm. Though her attempt to strike Darth Bane was doomed to failure, Bane was pleased to note that she at least attempted to focus her power and catch him off guard by targeting his ankle. Zannah refined her telekinesis as Bane's apprentice, but stopped making such avid use of it, instead relegating it to a support role such as retrieving her lightsaber. Instead, her power was expressed through her strong telekinetic defense. 10 years into her training, when Bane was at the height of his Orbalisk-empowered frenzy, Zannah deflected the brunt of Bane's Force throw, being hurled through the air but catching the landing and avoiding any serious injury. Just before she claimed the Mantle of Mastery, she completely neutralized Set Hearth's Force Wave, and I think it's worth noting that, during their final confrontation on Umbria, not once did Darth Bane attempt to use telekinesis against Zannah, instead relying on energy-based attacks. It was during this particular confrontation that Darth Zannah provided her greatest display of power, drawing upon the local darkside nexus to summon flesh-dissolving tendrils of shadow during her final battle with Darth Bane. While Bane successfully closed the distance and exploited Zannah's inability to multitask by overwhelming her lightsaber defense and disarming her, Zannah managed a last-minute save by striking off Bane's sword arm with a tendril. However, Bane upped the ante by attempting to use Transfer Essence against Zannah, sacrificing his own body in a bid to steal hers. Though plagued by some residual traits, Darth Zannah proved her worthiness to hold the title of Dark Lord of the Sith by besting Bane in a battle of wills and banishing his spirit. Darth Zannah's specialization in Sith sorcery combined with her strong defensive foundation allowed her to neutralize conventional force strikes while bypassing conventional countermeasures with spell effects. Her success at finding a spell for everything, in addition to her skill at supporting her magics with mundane tricks and deceptions, made her extremely effective in her role as a Rule of Two Sith infiltrator. However, Zannah was basically operating in a vacuum, leveraging her prodigious force power through ancient arts that no one in her time frame was prepared to defend against, with major holes in her skill set remaining unaddressed because she was so overpowered that they almost never came up. To be fair, Vodo-Siosk Baas was operating under a similar handicap, relying on the unorthodox edge provided by Force Weapon while bringing down the hammer with Sever Force, but he did possess one major advantage. His skill set was specifically optimized to combat Sith sorcery. Where Zannah's spellcasting ability was a rarely seen novelty post-Ruusan, it was extremely common in Vodo Baas's era, practiced by the Nadists on Onderon and the Krath on Sinagar. Comparing their powers side by side, neither possessed any advantage within the control branch, both emphasizing the enhancement of agility and reflex, and neither demonstrating any skill in either the healing arts or energy manipulation. Within the Sense branch, Baas possessed much more refined precognitive abilities, with his mastery of Battle Mind and Battle Meditation providing proven countermeasures against Zannah's spells of fear and madness. Within the Altar branch, Zannah's defensive telekinesis is almost certain to neutralize Baas's attempts to disarm her, but due to her overspecialization in sorcery, she doesn't possess any meaningful telekinetic retaliation. Comparing what I would term their special abilities, Vodo Baas's Sever Force and Zannah's Darkside Tendrils, neither is likely to play a decisive role, as both treat such powers as a last resort. However, while it is possible that Baas can't use Sever Force against such a powerful Darksider without the support of his allies, Zannah definitively can't summon the Darkside Tendrils without the external power-up provided by a Darkside Nexus analogous to Umbria's Lake Nath. Essentially, Vodo Baas possesses all of the essential powers that allow him to neutralize everything Zannah is bringing to the table, and he possesses a possible trump card in Sever Force. But on the other hand, Baas's performance against Frida Nad indicates that he can be surprised by Sith magics, and he is unlikely to leverage Sever Force without the support of his allies, especially given his overwhelming preference for martial arts. Despite Baas's optimized skill set, neither combatant possesses a decisive advantage as a Force wielder. Though the equilibrium is fragile, Vodo-Siosk Baas and Darth Zannah basically cancel each other out, meaning that a hypothetical contest between these two would be decided by other factors. By the time of his death, 3,996 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Krivaki male Vodo-Siosk Baas was already centuries old. Evolved from shallow water crustaceans, the Krivaki were distinguished by their hard exoskeletons and their 8-segmented tentacle limbs, some with protrusions that functioned as opposable thumbs. Between their tentacled lower bodies and their non-expressive chitinous faces, the Krivaki were considered a bizarre species by the galaxy at large, the resulting xenophobia leading them to conceal their bodies beneath extensive clothing. Though he was typically garbed in floor-length Jedi robes, Vodo Baas wasn't restricted by cultural norms, and has attended lightsaber construction workshops in his birthday suit. As demonstrated by Saj Calician's degradation, Krivaki experienced a loss of sensation in their extremities as they aged, though Calician successfully overcame this through force enhancement. Furthermore, as a lifelong martial artist, Vodo Baas would have maintained a strict training regimen, which, in combination with Jedi meditations, likely mitigated the effects of his extreme age. He demonstrated acute reflexes and high acrobatic ability, and though he favored armed combat, the numerous tentacles provided a, shall we say, distinct advantage when grappling opponents. Secondly, his hard exoskeleton acted as natural armor, allowing him to shrug off minor hits. Essentially, Vodo-Siosk Baas enjoyed many of the same advantages as General Grievous, but not nearly to the same degree, being a born and bred biological life form and not a designed and built Jedi killer droid implanted with a living brain. Where Grievous could fight forever, Baas was centuries over the hill, succeeding on the back of technical skill, not physical might. In his first confrontation with Exar Kun, he dominated the early combat through reflex and technique, but was surprised by Kun's abrupt shift to Jarkai, and was pounded into submission with a strength-based dual-saber onslaught. Their second confrontation in the Senate Hall played out in a similar fashion, only this time Kun used his dexterity-based saber staff technique to beat his master at his own game, before finishing Baas off with a power overhand. This isn't to say that Vodo-Siosk Baas was in any way weak or handicapped, but he was old and he had his limits. Darth Zannah was a human female, approximately 30 years of age when she claimed the mantle of Dark Lord in 980 BBY. Born on the marshy world of Somov Rit, she spent her adolescence trawling the mud with her cousins, referring to herself by the nickname Rain, hiding her true name out of fear of being claimed by the mythological Swamp Demon. This nickname she abandoned when she pledged herself to the Sith. Though a conventional human specimen otherwise, Zannah was blessed with exceptional beauty, distinguished by her lustrous blonde hair and by the Sith tattoos across her eyes. Despite her prodigious Dark Force power, she was not yet afflicted by the extreme physical burnout associated with deep dark side immersion, only demonstrating the yellowed eyes. Due to her light build and lack of physical strength, Bane deemed her unfit for the heavy offensive techniques that he favored, instead training her to leverage her natural dexterity for redirection and evasion. This combined with her high stamina allowed her to dominate through attrition, an excellent example being her victory over Dark Jedi Set Hearth, who exhausted himself with his extended use of Form 4 acrobatics. However, despite being extremely disciplined, powering through toil and exhaustion through sheer strength of will, Zannah was still a physical lightweight. She knew how to take a hit, twisting her body to mitigate Bane's physical strikes and grapples on multiple occasions, but she couldn't take a beating. Her first serious altercation with Bane, when he attacked her in an Orbalisk-empowered frenzy, was ended by an elbow strike to the jaw that completely stunned her. In their final duel on Umbria, Zannah took an abdominal kick that left her with a broken rib, and though she successfully kept Bane at bay despite this injury, it ruled out physical combat as a viable option for her, forcing her to rely completely on her sorcery. Due to the need to keep a low profile, Zannah didn't have the option of supplementing her lightweight physique with armor, nor would such garb have been appropriate for her dexterity-based fighting style. Instead, Darth Zannah generally alternated between simple Sith robes or whatever costume she was wearing as part of her cover identity. As Alia Omek on Syutric 4, she wore fitted black pants and a silver-embroidered red vest, the fashion of the day, and practical garb that did not restrict her movements. Comparing the giant talking crab to the supermodel athlete, Vodo-Siosk Baas enjoys a significant advantage in hand-to-hand combat, his tentacles making him an unparalleled grappler, and his hard exoskeleton allowing him to shrug off the hard kicks that Zannah occasionally employed. However, these advantages were counterbalanced by his extreme old age, where Zannah remained in the prime of her life. Though their athletic performance was roughly equivalent, both possessing high dexterity and acrobatic ability but low physical strength, Zannah was much more capable of maintaining her performance in an extended engagement. Armor and equipment doesn't factor in, as both favored simple robes, preferring to fight unencumbered, relying on technique. With Vodo Baas's anatomical advantages nullified by his old age, Darth Zannah's youth and stamina affords her the physical edge. Though known to possess his own green-bladed lightsaber, Vodo-Siosk Baas wielded a simple wooden quarterstaff as his primary weapon. As discussed earlier, the shaft was imbued with force energy in order to parry lightsabers, and could deliver strikes capable of shattering stone, though Baas's non-lethal takedown of Exar Kun demonstrated his control over the staff's output. His particular staff was sized to his stature, appearing to be approximately 1.5 meters in length, providing a reach advantage against meter-long lightsaber blades, but without being so long as to be unwieldy. The quarterstaff was the alternative weapon that Vodo Baas dedicated himself to as a Jedi weapon master, also referred to as an exotic weapons specialist. Respected for their expertise with esoteric implements and disciplines, weapon masters were a rare sight within the lightsaber-centric Jedi Order. Baas supported his core quarterstaff technique with a mastery of dual-weapon combat, and is known to have trained the Nyman master Exar Kun. Based on these factors, it can be surmised that Baas specialized in quarterstaff because it was an extremely simple technique that could be applied to the greatest number of weapons, with the force weapon power allowing him to use potentially any loose object as an improvised weapon in a lightsaber duel. With centuries of training and study under his belt, Vodo-Siosk Baas demonstrated a high degree of finesse and refinement in his core technique. Utilizing direct, simple movements, he generally preferred to use long form for offense, capitalizing on the quarterstaff's reach when striking, and short form for defense, blocking strikes with the belly of the weapon. His favorite attacks included limb strikes to disarm, body shots as takedowns, and likely using thrusts to deliver lethal finishers. His armed combat skill was supported by deft acrobatic recoveries and an anatomical advantage when grappling. Appropriately for a master who taught constant vigilance, Vodo Baas was extremely wary and would decisively intervene when situations boiled over, disarming Exar Kun when he nearly killed his fellow trainee Silvar in a fit of rage. Unfortunately, Baas's efforts to defuse the situation were stymied by Credo, who provided Kun with his own lightsaber and encouraged him to challenge Baas. The two combatants squared off formally, and in the ensuing exchange, Baas had Kun at his mercy almost immediately, hurling him off his feet. However, Kun refused to accept defeat, retrieving his own lightsaber and surprising Vodo-Siosk with a heavy-handed Jarkai assault, pounding the old master into submission and shattering his staff. Their rematch in the Senate Hall played out in a similar fashion, with Baas successfully matching Exar Kun's core lightsaber technique, but getting thoroughly caught off guard when Kun abruptly shifted fighting styles. In this case, the dexterity-based attack flurries and tricata counters that Kun utilized with his dual-phase saber staff allowed him to beat Vodo Baas at his own game, shattering the Old Master's concentration before again shattering the Old Master's quarterstaff, this time killing him. While Vodo Baas's successful capture of Ulic Qel-Droma leads me to believe that he would resort to using his force abilities against an opponent that he couldn't outfence, but whether or not he would consistently be able to do so is in question. Though his repeated failures against Exar Kun suggest a middling level of effectiveness, my contention is that Baas has simply never been depicted fighting in his own element. Both of these confrontations took place on open ground against an opponent skilled at alternating his weaponry and fighting style, but without Baas being able to do the same in return. As I've mentioned several times throughout this video, Baas's force weapon ability allows him to use any loose object as an improvised weapon in a lightsaber duel, so imagine what he could do when fighting in a kitchen space or an industrial workshop. However, Vodo-Siosk Baas's limitations cannot be ignored either, as he was a martial purist, with all of the positive and negative connotations that came with it. He was swift and decisive, with a significant advantage against traditional tactics and techniques, but his own approach and methodology was extremely rigid, leaving him unprepared for abrupt style shifts or deviations from pattern. Baas's main shortcoming was that his skill level was so advanced that, 9 times in 10, he couldn't possibly lose, which meant that major weaknesses in his style and tactics were never properly addressed because they never came up, and on the day when they finally did, it was too late. Darth Zannah was armed with the Bane's Heart lightsaber, a customized saber staff that eventually fell into the hands of General Grievous. The hilt followed the standard design configuration with an extended handle to accommodate the additional focusing crystals. Notably, the weapon was calibrated to project 75cm blades, sacrificing reach and leverage to improve maneuverability and speed. Furthermore, one of the 2 synthetic gems powering the blades was the unique Bane's Heart, an alchemically treated crystal gifted to Zannah by her master. The most notable feature of the gem was that it could only be used by the specific force wielder that it was attuned to, and would emit electrical discharges as a security measure anytime the lightsaber containing it was wielded by someone else. Darth Bane steered his apprentice towards specializing in Form 3 lightsaber combat Surisu, as he viewed her lightweight build as unsuitable for his own preferred techniques, Gemso and Juyo. Surisu, also referred to as the Resilience form, was an almost purely defensive fighting style originally intended for blast deflection, with Zannah's application centered around keeping opponents at bay while fatigue and frustration took their toll. Furthermore, Bane's training provided Zannah with a strong familiarity of numerous lightsaber forms, allowing her to recognize and counter an opponent's fighting style, a good example being when she assessed Set Hearth's Ataru technique during their duel on Nar Shaddaa. In combat, Zannah was constantly moving, lightly dancing about the battlefield, spinning to maneuver her weapon, and employing acrobatic evasions. Her blade work consisted of twirling defensive velocities intended to slap aside enemy attacks, either setting up for a counter or simply transitioning into the next parry. Furthermore, she was capable of integrating physical combat into her lightsaber sequences, staggering Set Hearth with multiple kicks. However, given that she wasn't a heavy hitter like her master, she overwhelmingly favored lightsaber combat, and took every advantage she could get, using thrusting backstabs whenever the opportunity presented itself. A good example of the typical engagement that Darth Zannah could expect as a Rule of Two Sith infiltrator was when she allowed herself to be captured by the revolutionaries Sindra and Pack, who brought her before their backer, the Serenoan noble Hetton. Upon sensing Hetton's dark force power, Zannah decided to declare herself, unleashing a fear spell on Sindra and destroying her mind, before retrieving her lightsaber and casually fending off Pak's brutish vibroblade assault. When Pak realized that he was overmatched and pulled a blaster, Zannah simply used guided blast deflection to finish him off. A perfect example of Zannah in her element. However, Zannah's defensive technique was not without limitations, especially early on. When attacked by an Orbalisk-empowered Darth Bane, Zannah was immediately forced into a desperate retreat, barely fending off his lightsaber strikes, and ultimately pounded into submission with physical combat, only narrowly managing to defuse the situation. Similarly, she was almost overwhelmed by Sero Zaj on Tython. The engagement in Belia Darzu's fortress started off favorably, with Zannah positioning herself in the corner of the chamber, using the walls to cover her flanks, and successfully playing the lesser swordsman Johun Othone against Zaj, subverting his offensive. However, the moment Othone broke off and disengaged, Zannah was immediately put on her back foot by Zaj. Zannah only survived when the Jedi battle meditation empowering Zaj was interrupted, allowing her to unleash an illusion spell against her distracted opponent before striking him down unawares. She followed this up by casting a concealment spell and backstabbing Jedi Weapon Master Rasta Lasu. Comparing and contrasting the representations of Zannah in Rule of Two versus Dynasty of Evil, I would characterize her as having learned from her successes but not her failures. Instead of fleshing out her skill set with a stronger offensive technique, she doubled down on her defensive technique and made the incorporation of Sith spells her primary tactic. To be fair, she was extremely formidable, proving her mettle against the Dark Jedi Set Hearth, sussing out his fighting style and ultimately toying with him, before disabling him with a fear spell intended to test his mental fortitude. Given her high skill level, it's fair to assume that this is the level of effectiveness that she could reliably expect against the vast majority of potential opponents within her setting. However, her effectiveness against Darth Bane was middling. In their first bout on Doan, Zannah successfully cornered Bane, unarmed, in a confined space, but instead of leveraging her sorcery while he was helpless to respond, she allowed herself to be goaded into exploiting his physical vulnerability and attacking with her lightsaber. Due to Zannah's inexperience as the aggressor, Bane's hand-to-hand skills allowed him to keep her at bay long enough to engineer his own escape. When they squared off properly on Umbria, lightsaber to lightsaber, Zannah successfully held off Bane's experienced assault, but allowed herself to be maneuvered onto unsure ground, losing her footing. Though she managed to get away alive, the beating she took forced her to completely abandon physical combat, and she won only through an escalating application of Sith sorcery. The specific technique that Darth Zannah's defensive style appeared to be based around was the Circle of Shelter, using her twirling defensive velocities to create a safe zone around her body. Within the Jedi Order, the Circle of Shelter was practiced as a moving meditation to enable Force precognition, which occasionally opened the Jedi practitioner to visions of the future. Zannah, by contrast, could not divide her attention between lightsaber combat and Force abilities, unable to employ her spells when under extreme pressure, and failing to mind her surroundings while concentrating. This demonstrated that her mastery of Surisu was purely technical, simply a mechanical application of the core physical moveset. Rather than possessing true harmony with the Force, Darth Zannah merely played it safe, expertly capitalizing on circumstantial factors while being completely unwilling to take any risks, conducting herself as if made of glass. Though Exar Kun was not the original creator of the double-bladed lightsaber, he was the first Sith Lord to wield it in combat against the Jedi, with Vodo-Siosk Baas being his first and most notable combat kill with the weapon. However, I do not believe that Kun won that fight purely on the back of the novelty value of the saberstaff itself, especially given the restrictive nature of such a weapon, instead owing his victory to the Trikata tactics enabled by his weapon's variable blade settings. In essence, Kun created a lightsaber that was effectively several weapons in one, and could be reconfigured on the fly to confuse opponents. These are advantages that Darth Zannah does not enjoy. Though the Bane's Heart saberstaff also incorporated custom design features intended to reinforce Zannah's Surisu technique, they were direct trade-offs that impaired her effectiveness in other areas, rather than weapon settings that could be deactivated on a whim. While the saberstaff provided a similar amount of surface area to Baas's quarterstaff, her shortened blades made his reach advantage all the more palpable. The one point of commonality between the two was that they both used alternative weaponry to enable their simple and refined core fighting styles, but this was expressed in opposite ways. Between his mastery of quarterstaff technique, his skill with dual wielding, and the options provided by Force Weapon, Vodo Baas possessed an extremely versatile core skill set that allowed him to wield any loose object with lethal proficiency. By contrast, Darth Zannah's style and weapon, quite simply, did one thing and one thing only, with her attempts to function in other roles proving quite clumsy. To be fair, Zannah was familiarized with numerous fighting techniques, successfully withstood Darth Bane's probing assault on Umbria, and she still had the unorthodox edge of the saberstaff going for her against Baas. The problem is that her fighting style was too passive and repetitive to effectively leverage her advantages. Furthermore, I would consider Zannah's fighting style to be predicated on her balletic poise and balance, the very attributes that Baas is particularly experienced at subverting. Exar Kun's victory proved that Vodo-Siosk Baas was very much stuck in his own box, just as Zannah was, but his box ultimately contained more than hers. Zannah's predicament is worsened by the fact that her primary tactic is to simply stall for time before unleashing her Sith magics, which means that even if she realizes that her martial technique is outclassed, she's unconcerned because she's not even attempting to win. She won't realize how much trouble she's in against Baas until later in the fight, when her spells fail to crush him, and by then it would be too late. For Vodo Baas, a confrontation with Darth Zannah would be the ultimate masterclass in how to combat the saberstaff, as Zannah's passive style would allow him to poke and prod her with relative impunity, figuring out the weaknesses of her weapon and how best to exploit them. At the end of the day, Darth Zannah is precisely the sort of opponent that Baas is specifically optimized to combat, a dark side sorceress who relies on mind-altering abilities to break her opponents, while only using her weapon for close quarters defense. Baas's mastery of the more clerical Jedi powers neutralizes her dark side magics, allowing him to leverage his superiority as a martial artist and overwhelm her. Zannah's use of the double-bladed lightsaber does provide her with a certain unorthodox edge, but her shortcomings in all other areas reduces it to a mere stall tactic. I declare Vodo-Siosk Baas the victor.